to jump into, hopefully I can read this pretty quickly and complete the entirety of the book in this sitting. I have an appointment in 2.5 hours, and I'm going to have to be aware. So I need to keep this to about 1 hour 45. Okay. In spite of the discouraging signs in Washington in January 1992, while Shamir was still in office, the Palestinian delegation put forward the outline of a proposal for a Palestinian Interim Self-Governing Authority, or PISGA, as we called it, which we foresaw as a stepping stone to a state. An enhanced and more substantive version was presented in March. Its core idea was the creation of a Palestinian government entity whose authority was to be derived from its election by the people, including Palestinian residents of the West Bank, Jerusalem, the Gaza Strip, those displaced from the areas in 1967, as well as those deported since then by Israel. Following the election, the Israeli military government and its occupation bureaucracy, the euphemistically named civil administration, would transfer all powers to this new authority, after which these Israeli bodies would withdraw. The authority would have complete jurisdiction, but neither sovereignty nor full security control over the air, land, and water of the entirety of the occupied territories, including settlements, but not settlers, and over all their Palestinian inhabitants. Israel would have been obliged to freeze settlement activity and withdraw its troops, quote, to redeployment points along the borders of the occupied Palestinian territories, unquote, when this authority came into being. Outline of the Palestinian Interim Self-Governing Authority, PISGA, delivered January 14th, 1992. A more detailed version of the plan was delivered to the Israeli side on March 2nd, 1992. Quote, Palestinian Interim Self-Government Arrangements, expanded outline of model of Palestinian Interim Self-Government Authority, preliminary measures and modalities for elections. March 2nd, 1993. Although the PISGA proposal constituted a genuine effort to envisage a transition from occupation to independence, it was ultimately a vain attempt to do an end around the limitations that constrained the negotiations and the restricted forms of self-rule that Israel was prepared to countenance. These essentially reserved all powers over security, land, water, airspace, population registers, movement, settlements, and most other matters of importance for Israel. There were many reasons for the PISGA proposal's failure, the main one being the doctrine that was at the root of the Palestinians' displacement, the Zionist doctrine of the exclusive Jewish right to the entirety of Palestine. Jurisdiction, as it was broadly envisaged in the PISGA proposal, contradicted that core doctrine from which everything else flowed. It came far too close to the no-no of sovereignty to be acceptable to Rubinstein and his political bosses, be they Yitzhak Shamir or Yitzhak Rabin. Tunis formed another obstacle. Although the PLO leadership had approved the proposal, I sensed a distinct lack of enthusiasm for the concepts it embodied. They failed to promote it internationally, in the Arab world, or in Israel, even though such promotion might have provided it with some momentum. Perhaps they knew the Israeli government would never accept it, and they were overly eager for an acceptable deal, any deal. Or their tepid response may have been due to jealousy of a delegation that had actually produced a complex and carefully crafted plan instead of simply reacting to whatever was presented by their adversaries, as the PLO had done since the beginning of the process and still does to this day. This problem was exacerbated by the deep tensions running between the PLO in Tunis and the Palestinians from the occupied territories, many of them veteran leaders of the Intifada, who were the official members of the delegation. We were all aware of this tension, and we saw it flare into open dispute on occasion. Many of us were present in Faisal Husseini's Washington hotel suite during furious phone exchanges between him and Arafat. The Israelis were also aware of the tension and happy to exploit it. In 1993, they suddenly changed the ground rules and allowed the direct participation of Husseini, Ashwari, and others, including us advisors, who had been excluded from the formal negotiations. This may have seemed like a gracious concession, but as Rabin told Clinton during the meeting, his goal in so doing was to sow divisions among the Palestinians in the hope that, quote, a local leader could stand up to Arafat, unquote. Rabinovich, Yitzhak Rabin, 183. These divide and rule tactics, which Rabin had employed when he was defense minister, are standard procedure for any colonial ruler, but they did not matter in the end. After rejecting our PIS-GA proposal, the delegation to Washington received no serious counterproposal from the Israelis that would have meaningfully changed the colonial status quo inside Palestine. In consequence, the Washington talks proved fruitless. Something fundamental did eventually change in the Israeli position. Although we had only an inkling of this shift during our time in Washington. After more than a year and a half of stalemate and frustration, we learned that an important secret exchange had taken place between the PLO and Israel during the last round of talks with the Israelis in Washington in June 1993. Ashwari and I were tasked with drafting a document overnight to serve as the basis for a briefing on this exchange that we were to give the next day to diplomats representing the American sponsors. When I heard what we were supposed to tell them, I was surprised. The PLO and Israel, we learned, had reached a confidential understanding whereby PLO cadres and forces, quote, possibly including officers of the Palestine Liberation Army, unquote, were to be allowed to enter the occupied territories and take up duties there as security forces. This was a revelation to those of us who were to deliver the briefing. If true, it meant that the PLO and Israel had been engaged in covert direct negotiations. There had been rumors to this effect, and that had already reached a tentative understanding on the issue paramount to both Rabin and Arafat: security. We later learned that this breakthrough was the result of the opening of an undisclosed negotiating track that was completely separate from the secret Oslo talks and has never received the same degree of fame. This was only one of several tracks that were being authorized while keeping the existence of each one hidden from those involved in the others. Ibid, 159-91, cites two other, quote, alternative channels to Oslo, quote, unquote, and to Washington that Rabin ordered opened, but does not mention this one. The leading protagonists in the parallel Oslo negotiations, Israeli Foreign Minister Shimon Peres and Ahmed Kurey Abu Allah, had richly deserved reputations as relentless self-promoters, and it was to be expected that they would ensure that their story obliterated any other, which is just what happened. Neither of them particularly modest, both Perez and Abu al-Ala wrote extensively, the latter exhaustively, about their roles in Oslo. Abu al-Ala, Ahmed Kure, al-Riwa al-Fistinania al-Kamila lil-Mufawada min Oslo ila Kalaterat al-Tariq, The Complete Palestinian Accounts of the Negotiations from Oslo to the Roadmap, Volumes 1 through 4, Beirut Institute for Palestine Studies, 2005-2014. Shimon Peres, Battling for Peace, a Memoir, New York, Random House, 1995. By contrast, Rabin and Arafat used confidential intermediaries to come to a quiet understanding on the key issues of security, which was an essential precondition and the basis for the success of the better known and more exhaustive Oslo process that was simultaneously underway. The security talks took place entirely outside the limelight, in a location that is still secret, via discreet envoys, and little is known about them to this day. They were headed on Israel's side by a former chief of military intelligence, who also served as the first coordinator for dealing with the Palestinians under occupation. Major General Shlomo Gazit. Rabin seemed to repose full confidence only in senior serving reserve and retired officers such as Gazit and Rabinovich. In Rabinovich's words, Yitzhak Rabin, 187, quote, Rabin trusted former officers of the IDF, unquote, among them himself. Arafat had the same inclination, and thus Gazit's opposite member was Nizar Amar, a senior officer in the late Abu Iliad intelligence services, who later served as commander of the security forces of the Palestinian Authority. 53. One can search in vain in the bios of these two men, and in the case of Amar, who died in 2010, his obituary, for any mention of their roles in securing an Israeli-Palestinian security agreement. Arafat had clearly authorized the briefing that Hanan, my colleagues, and I were about to give. I knew that because, incredulous that the Israelis had contemplated accepting such expansive terms, we sent the draft to Tunis, which somewhat toned down what we had been told to say. We immediately got back emendations in Arafat's unmistakably handwriting, restoring the draft to full strength. On June 23, 1993, we briefed Dan Kurtzer and Aaron David Miller, and they were incredulous as well, even though we had not been authorized to say explicitly that a formal agreement existed, which was true at best. It was an informal, albeit significant, understanding. Hanan Ashrawi said that to provide for security, the Palestinians needed to, quote, draw on external resources, unquote. For example, quote, officers in the PLA, unquote, with relevant experience. I added that, quote, Israeli security managers, unquote, understood that such individuals were a necessity. One of the American diplomats quickly grasped that something, quote, may have been going on in communications between Israelis and Palestinians, unquote, but he doubted that such an arrangement would fly, quote, unless you have an understanding with the Israelis, unquote. I tried to reassure them, saying that, quote, we don't think we'll have a problem agreeing on this, unquote, with Israel. Quote, well, for the first time, we are speechless, unquote, Kurtzer said, while Miller added, quote, this security presentation is otherworldly, unquote. There are many detailed analyses of the reasons for the failures of the Oslo Accords and their sequels by participants in the Palestinian-Israeli-American negotiations. including Abu al-Ala, Shimon Peres, Yossi Beilin, Dennis Ross, Daniel Kurtzer, Aaron David Miller, Camille Mansour, Hanan Ashwari, Ghassan El-Khatib, and My Brokers of Deceit. Maybe I read the wrong one. Was I supposed to read 54? Draft minutes. Okay, I read the wrong one, guys. So I was supposed to read 54. Quote, draft minutes, meeting with the Americans, unquote, June 23rd, 1993. Makes a lot more sense. 55 is not on this page. Okay. These savvy U.S. diplomats undoubtedly knew that covert channels had been established between the two sides, but they found it hard to imagine that the PLO and Israel had been able to agree on anything so sweeping. They may have been chagrined as well, as this information went against everything they and Dennis Ross believed, as had always told their superiors at the State Department and in the White House. The Israelis would never deal directly with the PLO, let alone allow PLA forces into the occupied territories to take charge of security. Whatever their reaction, though, it was no longer up to the Americans. This important shift resulted from the lesson Rabin had learned from the Intifada, that Israel could no longer control the occupied territories solely by the use of force. In consequence, he was willing to do some things differently than Begin and Shamir, while continuing the military occupation and the colonization of what remained of Palestine. Indeed, spending on the settlements was curbed under Rabin's government, but overall settlement activity increased. To this end, Rabin authorized direct contact with the PLO, but held fast to the narrow option of limited self-rule. In time, these clandestine contacts led Rabin to accept the return of most of the PLO's leaders and cadres to Palestine in the context of mutual recognition between the two sides, which was the basis of the Declaration of Principles between Israel and the PLO that was signed on the White House lawn in September 1993. By this agreement, Israel recognized the PLO as representative of the Palestinian people, and the PLO recognized the State of Israel. When Rabin had done something no other Israeli leader ever done by formally conceding that there was a Palestinian people, accepting the PLO as their representative, and opening negotiations with it, obtaining in return its recognition of the State of Israel, this exchange was neither symmetrical nor reciprocal. Israel had not recognized the Palestinian state or even made a commitment to allow the creation of one. This was a peculiar transaction whereby a national liberation movement had obtained nominal recognition from its oppressors without achieving liberation, by trading its own recognition of the state that had colonized its homeland and continued to occupy it. This was a resounding historic mistake, one with grave consequences for the Palestinian people. By June 1993, 3 months before the ceremonial signing on the White House lawn, the Washington talks were no longer the primary site for negotiations between the PLO and Israel. The most important of the various covert direct lines of communication that had opened up between the two parties was in Oslo. The two sides wished to escape the attention of our American hosts in the media although that was a subsidiary reason for the shift. Once Rabin and Arafat had found that a direct deal was possible, they assigned various emissaries to explore the possibilities further. The talks in Oslo were authorized by the two leaders, but were supervised on the Israeli side by Shimon Peres and on the Palestinian by Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen. It was there that the Declaration of Principles, which came to be called Oslo I, or Oslo I, was worked out and where the details of the agreement between the two sides were tied up. The problem with the agreement was that the devil is in the details, and the personnel the PLO sent to Oslo were not strong on details. Indeed, they did not have the linguistic or legal or other expertise necessary to comprehend exactly what the Israelis were doing. After initial rounds of exploratory discussions led on the Israeli side by two academics, the Palestinians then found themselves up against a formidable and expert Israeli negotiating team, including individuals with vast international legal experience, such as Joel Singer, another former colonel in the Israeli military. Maybe it's Joel. This team was assembled by Shimon Peres, who was no more prepared to see the Palestinians as equals or to countenance Palestinian statehood and sovereignty than were Rabin or Shamir. The Palestinian envoys at Oslo were simply out of their league, lacking resources and training, none of them having been in occupied Palestine for decades, and having failed to study and absorb the results of our 10 rounds of negotiations with Israel. The deteriorating situation of the Palestinian population in the occupied territories after Oslo since the mid-1990s has been in large measure the result of the choice of envoys whose performance at Oslo was inept, and of Arafat and his colleagues' willingness to sign the defective agreements they drew up. Here's 55. There are many detailed analysis of the reasons for the failures of the Oslo Accords and their sequels by participants in the Palestinian-Israeli-American negotiations, including Abu al-Ala, Shimon Peres, Yossi Beilin, Dennis Ross, Daniel Kurtzer, Aaron David Miller, Camille Mansour, Hanan Eshwari, Ghassan al-Khatib, and my brokers of deceit. Sorry, y'all. When we first saw the text of what had been agreed in Oslo, those of us with 21 months of experience in Madrid and Washington grasped immediately that the Palestinian negotiators had failed to understand what Israel meant by autonomy. What they had signed on to was a highly restricted form of self-rule and a fragment of the occupied territories, and without control of land, water, borders, or much else. In these and subsequent accords based on them, in force until the present day with minor modifications, Israel retained all such prerogatives, indeed amounting to virtually complete control over land and people, together with most of the attributes of sovereignty. This was exactly what our PISGA proposal had sought to avoid by attributing robust jurisdiction over people and land to an autonomous, elected Palestinian Authority. As a result of their failure to see the importance of these vital assets, the Palestinian negotiators at Oslo had fallen into trap after trap that we had managed to avoid. In effect, they ended up accepting a barely modified version of the Begin Autonomy Plan, to which both the Shamir and Rabin governments held firm. After Israel's rejection of the PISGA proposal, our delegation had refused to accept self-rule a la Begin. The delegates from the occupied territories knew what self-rule Israeli style would mean in practice, as did the advisors to the delegation who lived in or had spent extensive time in Palestine. Given the refusal of both the Shamir and Rabin governments to countenance a permanent settlement, freeze, or to end military rule, we knew that they were offering cosmetic changes only while intending to maintain the status quo of occupation into the indefinite future. This is why we dug in our heels in Washington, and why the PLO should have ordered its envoys in Oslo to stand firm against such a Begin-style deal, which Edward Said rightly called, quote, an instrument of Palestinian surrender, a Palestinian Versailles, unquote. 56. Quote the morning after, unquote. London Review of Books 15, number 20, October 21st, 1993. The steeply skeptical article was written at a time of near universal euphoria over the 1993 signing ceremony of the Oslo Accords on the White House lawn. Said was prescient in many respects, asking, quote, does this mean, ominously, that the interim stage may be the final one? As these lines are written, we are about to enter the 27th year of this interim stage. I am convinced that rejecting Israel's bare-bones offer in Washington and Oslo would have been the right course. Had the PLO taken such a tough stance, the outcome would not have been worse than the loss of land, resources, and freedom of movement suffered by the Palestinians since 1993. On balance, a failure to reach a deal would have been better than the deal that emerged from Oslo. Occupation would have continued, as it has anyway, but without the veil of Palestinian self-government, without relieving Israel of the financial burden of government, in administering a population of millions, and without, quote, security coordination, unquote, the worst outcome of Oslo, whereby the PA helps Israel police the arrested Palestinians living under its military regime as their lands are gradually appropriated by Israeli colonizers. There is also the small chance that Rabin might have been forced to concede better terms. Whether such hypothetical terms might have led to a truly sovereign Palestinian state is impossible to say. However, just as the PLO felt compelled to secure a deal, Rabin too felt the need to produce an agreement, especially after progress on the Syrian track stalled. According to Itamar Rabinovich, by August 1993, Rabin felt pressure to make a dramatic move, given the stalemate after a year of negotiations with Syria and the Palestinians, and the instability of the coalition government he headed. Rabinovich, Yitzhak Rabin, 193. That move might have been in the direction of a better deal for the Palestinians. This outcome does not seem likely, however, since Rabin proved to be constrained by his limitations and biases. An ingrained preoccupation with security, which in the Israeli lexicon has an all-encompassing meaning of complete domination and control of the adversary, and a deep disdain for Palestinian nationalism, and the PLO in particular, which he had fought for much of his career. This disdain was evident on Rabin's face when he shook Arafat's hand in Washington in September 1993. He also had to take account of the ferocious opposition to any genuine agreement that the Palestinians from the fervent religious nationalist partisans of the greater land of Israel. He was right to fear this potent group. One of its adherents, Yigal Amir, killed him in 1995, and they have dominated Israeli politics ever since. Yasser Arafat returned to Palestine in July 1994, and I visited him soon after his new headquarters overlooking the sea in Gaza. I'll reread that because I read that wrong. Yasser Arafat returned to Palestine in July 1994, and I visited him soon after in his new headquarters overlooking the sea in Gaza. He was ecstatic to be back in his homeland after nearly 30 years and to have escaped from the gilded cage that had been his lot in Tunis. He did not seem to realize that he had moved from one cage to another. I had come to express my deep concern about the deteriorating situation in Arab East Jerusalem where I had been living. Israel had closed the city off to Palestinians from the rest of the occupied territories and had begun erecting a series of walls, massive fortified border checkpoints, to regulate their entry. There were many worrying signs that things were getting worse for the Palestinian population of Jerusalem, with draconian restrictions on the entry of West Bankers and Gazans, starving the economy of the Arab part of the city, and an acceleration of land seizure, home demolitions, the exile of Jerusalemites, whom Israel arbitrarily deemed had lost their residency. Arafat brushed aside my concerns. I soon realized that my visit was a waste of time. He was still afloat on a wave of euphoria, enjoying the homage of worship delegations from all over Palestine. He was in no mood to hear bad news, and in any case, he airily indicated any problems would soon be resolved. I received precisely the same brush-off later that day when I expressed similar concerns to Abu Mazen, also newly arrived in Gaza. It was clear to me that Arafat and Abu Mazen optimistically assumed that what their envoys had been unable to obtain for the Palestinians at Oslo, they would manage to extract from Israel in subsequent negotiations. Arafat was presumably relying on his legendary skill at maneuvering, with which he had for decades dealt with the Arab regimes, eventually wearing out the patience of many of their monarchs and dictators. But the Israelis were not in the least susceptible to the legerdemain of which Arafat was famous. They stuck grimly to their guns, and later accords were just as one-sided as Oslo I. The interim agreement on the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, or Oslo II, as it is known, was agreed upon by the two sides in 1995 and completed the ruinous work of Oslo I. It carved out both regions into an infamous patchwork of areas, A, B, and C, with over 60% of the territory, Area C, under complete, direct, and unfettered Israeli control. The Palestinian Authority was granted administrative and security control in the 18% that constituted Area A, and administrative control in the 22% of Area B, while Israel remained in charge of security there. Together, Areas A and B comprised 40% of the territory, but housed some 87% of the Palestinian population. Area C included all but one of the Jewish settlements. Israel also kept full power over entering and leaving all parts of Palestine and held exclusive control of the population registers, meaning that it decided who had residency rights and who could live where. Settlement construction was able to continue apace. Jerusalem was further severed from the West Bank, and Palestinians from the occupied territories were increasingly barred from entering Israel. Eventually, scores of military checkpoints and hundreds of miles of walls and electrified fences carved the West Bank into a series of isolated islands and scarred the landscape. It soon became impossible to do what I and many Palestinians had done regularly and without difficulty: drive to Ramallah from Jerusalem in under half an hour, or travel quickly to Gaza from the West Bank. I will never forget the lone Israeli soldier, tipped back on a chair, his weapon on his lap, who lazily waved us through the ramshackle checkpoint that marked the entry to the Gaza Strip as we entered on my first visit there after the Oslo Accords. With the new checkpoints and walls, and the need for hard-to-obtain Israeli permits to pass through them, with Israeli blocking free movement among the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, and with the introduction of roads forbidden to Palestinian travel, the progressive constriction of Palestinian life, especially for Gazans, was underway. Arafat and his colleagues in the PLO leadership, who sailed through the checkpoints with their VIP passes, did not seem to know or care about the increasing confinement of ordinary Palestinians. Most PLO personnel soon moved from Tunis and elsewhere to the occupied territories, where they took positions, usually the top ones, in the security forces and in the institutions of the PA. The authority had supposedly been set up as the interim body for self-rule in the occupied territories, to be supplanted in a few years by a permanent form of governance after final status negotiations, which never happened. The PLO carried out its wholesale relocation as if liberation had already occurred, instead of keeping part, if not most, of the PLO apparatus outside Palestine until the outcome of the Oslo Accords was clear. Only the political department, its foreign ministry, and a few other offices remained in Tunis or in other countries. On a human level, it was easy to sympathize with the wish to return home after a lengthy exile, as well as the desire to escape the unwelcoming Arab capitals to which the PLO had been consigned since 1982. It also made sense for the organization's people to live among their popular political base, the segment located inside Palestine, after they had been cut off from most Palestinian communities. But there was a hidden peril in bringing most of the PLO to the still occupied territories. Arafat and his colleagues had effectively put themselves in a cage, at the mercy of a military regime that remained in place and largely unchanged. In an ominous sign, Israel tried to prevent some of the PLO's personnel from living in Jerusalem or operating there. Worse was to come. In 2002, at the height of the intense violence of the Second Intifada, Israeli troops stormed the PA's offices in Ramallah and other parts of Area A. They also shut down Orient House, along the center of Palestinian political activity in Jerusalem, and headquarters for the teams negotiating with Israel. It remains closed to this day. Some of the documents seized there, including materials dating back to the 1930s from the historical archives of the Arab Studies Society, such as papers of Musa al-Alami, which I examined there in the early 1990s, can now be found in the Israel National Archives under the heading AP for Abandoned Property. They sit alongside materials stolen from the PLO Research Center in Beirut in 1982, and books that were seized from Arab homes in an early organized looting spree in 1948. The continuous process of theft of Palestinian culture and intellectual assets constitutes a form of memoricide, an integral part of Israel's campaign of politicide against the Palestinians, again in the late Baruch Kimmerling's apt usage. Israel was also able to restrict or forbid any Palestinian activities, travel, or meetings, and it used this power liberally against the PA's leaders. In effect, the PLO had entered the lion's mouth, and it did not take long for the jaws to snap shut. In September 2002, the Israeli army imposed a siege on the Muqata, Arafat's Ramallah HQ, making him a virtual prisoner for the next 2 years until shortly before he died. In the quarter century since the Oslo agreements, the situation in Palestine and Israel has often been falsely described as a clash between two near equals, between the State of Israel and the quasi-state of Palestinian Authority. This depiction masks the unequal, unchanged colonial reality. The PA has no sovereignty, no jurisdiction, and no authority except that is allowed by Israel, which even controls a major part of its revenues in the form of customs duties and some taxes. Its primary function, to which much of its budget is devoted, is security, but not for its people. It is mandated by U.S. and Israeli dictates to provide security for Israel's settlers and occupation forces against the resistance, violent and otherwise, of other Palestinians. Since 1967, there has been one state otherwise of other Palestinians. Since 1967, there's been one state authority in all of the territory of mandatory Palestine, that of Israel. The creation of the PA did nothing to change that reality, rearranging the deck chairs on the Palestinian Titanic while providing Israeli colonization and occupation with an indispensable Palestinian shield. Facing the colossus that is the Israeli state is a colonized people denied equal rights and the ability to exercise their right of national self-determination, a continuous condition since the idea of self-determination took hold globally after World War I. The Intifada had brought Rabin and the Israeli security establishment to the realization that the occupation, with Israeli troops policing densely populated Palestinian centers, simmering with anger, needed modification. The result of that realization, the Oslo Framework, was designed to preserve those parts of the occupation that were advantageous to Israel. The privileges and prerogatives enjoyed by the state and settlers, while offloading onerous responsibilities and simultaneously preventing genuine Palestinian self-determination, statehood, and sovereignty. Oslo I was the first such modification, with others added in subsequent years, all of them aimed at maintaining the disparity of power, irrespective of who was Israel's prime minister. Oslo I also involved the most far-reaching modification, which was the decision to enlist the PLO as a subcontractor for the occupation. This was the actual meaning of the security deal Rabin made with Arafat, which my colleagues and I announced to the American diplomats in June 1993. The key point was always security for Israel, for its occupation settlers, while offloading the cost and liability of subjugating the Palestinian population. More bluntly, as Rabin's collaborator Maj, General Shalom Gazit, put it publicly in 1994, Yasser Arafat has a choice. He can be a Lad or he can be a super Lad. I was present and heard Gazit say this in response to a question from the audience during a panel discussion at Amherst College on March 4th, 1994. Gazit's reference was to Antoine Lad, the Lebanese commander of the Israeli army, Israeli paid, and Israeli-controlled South Lebanese army, tasked with helping to maintain Israel's occupation of South Lebanon from 1978 to 2000. With this revealing remark, Gazit confirmed the real objective of what he and his boss, Rabin, had put in place with Oslo. The system, created in Oslo and Washington, was not just Israel's venture. As in 1967 and 1982, Israel was joined by its indispensable sponsor, the United States. The Oslo straitjacket could not have been imposed on the Palestinians without American connivance. From Camp David back in 1978 on, the architecture of the negotiations, with its devious and infinitely flexible interim stage and deferral of Palestinian statehood, was not enforced primarily by Israel, even if the framework was dreamed up by Begin and carried forward by his heirs in both Israeli political blocs, Likud, and Labor. It was the United States that provided the muscle behind the assistance for the Palestinians. This was only possible negotiating path, leading to only one possible outcome. The United States was not just an accessory, it was Israel's partner. This partnership involved far more than simply acquiescence or consent on the part of every U.S. administration from Carter until today. It has relied on American support on the political, diplomatic, military, and legal levels. The bountiful sums of money in aid, loans, and tax-free charitable donations given to support the settlements and the creeping absorption of Arab neighborhoods in Jerusalem and the copious flow of the world's most advanced arms to advance Israel's colonization of the entirety of Palestine. The Oslo Accords, in effect, constituted another internationally sanctioned American-Israeli declaration of war on the Palestinians, in furtherance of the Zionist movement's century-old project. But unlike 1947 and 1967, this time Palestinian leaders allowed themselves to be drawn into complicity with their adversaries. Chapter 6, the sixth declaration of war, 2000 to 2014. This is a unique colonialism that we've been subjected to, where they have no use for us. The best Palestinian for them is either dead or gone. It's not that they want to exploit us or that they need to keep us there in the way of Algeria or South Africa as a subclass. Edward Said. For most Palestinians, deep disappointment with the Oslo Accords set in not long after the 1993 signing ceremony on the White House lawn. The prospect of an end to the military occupation and to the theft of land for the Israeli settlements had originally been received with euphoria, and many people believed they were at the beginning of a path leading to statehood. As time went on, there was a dawning realization that despite and even because of the terms of Oslo, the colonization of Palestine was continuing apace, and Israel was no closer to allowing the creation of an independent Palestinian state. In fact, conditions grew much worse for all but very small number of individuals whose economic or personal interests were intertwined with the Palestinian Authority and who benefited from normalized relations with Israel. For everyone else, there were consistent denials of permission to travel, move goods from one place to another as labyrinth systems of permits, checkpoints, walls, and fences were created. In a conscious Israeli policy of separation, Gaza was severed from the West Bank, which was itself severed from Jerusalem. Jobs within Israel did not return. The settlements and settler-only roads between them proliferated, fragmenting the West Bank to devastating effect. Between 1993 and 2004, GDP per capita declined, despite promises of prosperity that was just around the corner. Palestinian GDP per capita remained at about $1,380 from 1995 to 2000. It declined by over $340 from 2000 to 2004, and even more in subsequent years. Statistics from UNCTAD, quote, report on UNCTAD's assistance to the Palestinian people, unquote, July 21, 2005. A privileged few, influential figures with the PLO or the PA, were granted VIP passes that allowed them to sail through the Israeli checkpoints. Everyone else lost the ability to move freely around Palestine. Until 1991, great numbers of Palestinians had worked in Israel without hindrance, without requiring a special permit. One could travel in a car with the West Bank or Gaza license plates anywhere in Israel and in the occupied territories. Any expectation of having that freedom restored was quickly quashed. The majority of the population could not obtain permits to travel and was now effectively confined to the West Bank or the Gaza Strip. To the inferior roads, dotted with checkpoints intended for the indigenous population, while the settlers rode above them on a network of superb highways and overpasses that was constructed for their exclusive use. This post-Oslo confinement was most constricting in the Gaza Strip. In the decades following 1993, the Strip was cut off from the rest of the world in stages. encircled by troops on land and the Israeli Navy by sea. Ben White notes that the isolation of the Gaza Strip actually began with restrictions on movement of Gaza residents into Israel via new magnetic cards in 1989, 17 years before Hamas took over. Quote, Gaza, isolation and control. Al Jazeera News, June 10th, 2019. Entering and leaving required rarely issued permits and became possible only through massive fortified checkpoints resembling human cattle pens, while arbitrary Israeli closures frequently interrupted the shipment of goods in and out of the Strip. The economic results of what was in effect a siege on the Gaza Strip were particularly damaging. Most Gazans depended on work in Israel or on exporting goods. With stringent restrictions on doing both, economic life underwent a slow strangulation. There is a plethora of scholarship on the situation in Gaza, notably the work of Sarah Roy, including The Gaza Strip, The Political Economy of De-Development, Washington, D.C., Institute for Palestine Studies, 1994, and Hamas and Civil Society in Gaza, Engaging in Islamist Social Sector, Princeton, New Jersey, Princeton University Press, 2011, as well as Jean-Pierre Filou, Gaza, A History, Oxford University Press, 2014. In Jerusalem, the largest and most important urban center in Arab Palestine, barriers placed at the entrances to the Palestinian neighborhoods of East Jerusalem prevented free movement between the city and the West Bank hinterland, on which it depended economically, culturally, and politically. Its markets, schools, businesses, cultural institutions, and professional practices had all thrived primarily on a clientele from across the occupied territories, as well as Palestinians from inside Israel and foreign tourists. Suddenly, Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza were required to obtain permits, which were unattainable for most. Even if they managed to procure a permit, routine humiliation and hours of delay awaited them while passing through the Israeli checkpoints that controlled movement into the city from the West Bank. The impact of this closure of Jerusalem on the city's economy was shattering. According to a 2018 European Union report, the contribution of Arab East Jerusalem to the Palestinian GDP has shrunk from 15% to 1993 to 7% today. The EU report noted that due to its physical isolation and the strict Israeli permit policy, the city has largely ceased to be the economic, urban, and commercial center that it once was. Peter Smoller, Jerusalem, Les Diplomats de l'Udressesson Le Temps, Le Monde, February 2nd, 2018. These worsening conditions were barely noted in the mainstream media, and there was great surprise in international circles when the Palestinian population, still under occupation, expressed its bitter sense of betrayal via massive demonstrations in September 2000. The persistent, hazy glow of Oslo had blinded most observers, whether in Israel, the United States, or Europe, and especially within liberal Zionist circles. The myth of Oslo's beneficence continued to preclude clear-eyed analysis even after the eruption of violence in 2000. Evidence of this can be found in the rapturous reception in New York of the mediocre melodrama Oslo, with its borderline racist caricatures of Palestinian and Israeli negotiators and hagiographic depiction of Perez, which won a Tony Award as Best Play in 2017, and soon was enjoying a successful run in the West End in London. But the PLO's vigorous new rival, Hamas, the evidence that Oslo was not what its Palestinian advocates had made it out to be was grist for its mill. Founded at the outset of the First Intifada in December 1987, Hamas had grown quickly, capitalizing on the currents of popular discontent with the PLO that emerged for a variety of reasons. During the Intifada, Hamas had insisted on maintaining a separate identity, refusing to join the Unified National Command. It promoted itself as a more militant Islamist alternative to the PLO, denouncing the abandonment of armed struggle and turned to diplomacy that was adopted in the PNC's 1988 Declaration of Independence. Only the use of force could lead to the liberation of Palestine, Hamas argued, reasserting the claim to the entirety of Palestine, not just the areas occupied by Israel in 1967. The literature of Hamas is extensive. It includes Tarek Bukhani, Hamas Contained, The Rise and Pacification of Palestinian Resistance, Stanford, California, Stanford University Press, 2018. Roy, Hamas and Civil Society in Gaza, Ziad, Abu Amr, Islamic Fundamentalism in the West Bank and Gaza, Muslim Brotherhood and Islamic Jihad, Indianapolis, Indiana University Press, 1994. Khalid Harub, Hamas Political Thought and Practice, Washington, D.C. Institute for Palestine Studies, 2002. Michel and Salah, The Palestinian Hamas and Azam Tamami Hamas, A History from Within, Northampton, Massachusetts, Olive Branch, 2007. Hamas was an outgrowth of the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, an organization founded in Egypt in 1928 with reformist aims, but which turned to violence in the 1940s and 50s, only to reconcile with the Egyptian regime under Sadat in the 1970s. Hamas was begun in Gaza by militants who felt that the Brotherhood had been too accommodating toward the Israeli occupier, in return for lenient treatment. Indeed, in the first 2 decades of the occupation, when the military authorities severely repressed all other Palestinian political, social, cultural, professional, and academic groups, they had allowed the Brotherhood to operate freely. Because of its utility to the occupation in splitting the Palestinian national movement, Israeli indulgence of the Brotherhood was extended to Hamas, notwithstanding its compromising anti-Semitic program and commitment to violence. A good summary of how Israel supported Hamas is Mehdi Hassan, Blowback, How Israel Went from Helping Create Hamas to Bombing It. Intercept, February 19, 2018. See also the sources cited in note 19 of the previous chapter. This was not the main reason for its success, however. The rise of Hamas was part of the regional trend that represented a response to what many perceived as the bankruptcy of the secular nationalist ideologies that had dominated politics in the Middle East for most of the 20th century. In the wake of the PLO's shift away from armed struggle and toward a diplomatic path meant to lead to a Palestinian state that failed to achieve results, many Palestinians felt that the organization had lost its way, and Hamas grew in consequence, despite its extremely conservative social positions and a sketchy outline for the future it proposed. Hamas was momentarily disconcerted by the wave of popular satisfaction when the Madrid Peace Conference was convened with Palestinian participation, albeit under Israeli-imposed conditions. During the Washington negotiations, Hamas nevertheless continued to criticize the very principle of negotiating with Israel and maintained its efforts to keep the Intifada alive. The signing of the Oslo Accords had a similar effect in both raising Palestinian expectations and temporarily undermining Hamas. But given the PLO's standing was linked to the results of its dealings with Israel, the widespread popular disappointment that followed the implementation of the Oslo Accords left Hamas poised to reap the benefits, and it sharpened its critique of the PLO and the newly formed PA. Palestinians suffered another disappointment when the 5-year interim period specified in the Accords continued long after it should have ended. This was a further setback for Arafat's negotiating strategy, as was the fact that final status negotiations were never started, let alone completed, as they should have been by 1999. Another setback for the PLO was the failure in 2000 of the last-ditch Camp David summit between Arafat and Israel's Prime Minister Ehud Barak, called by President Clinton in the final months of his second term, when he was already a very lame duck, after Barak's government had lost its majority in the Knesset, and when Arafat's popularity was in sharp decline. The summit was poorly prepared. There had been no prior understandings between the two sides, as is normal in a summit-level meeting, and Arafat had to be coerced into attending, fearing being blamed for its eventual failure. Camp David ended in disaster, with Barak avoiding substantive meetings with Arafat and instead putting forward a secret proposal through the Americans while refusing any modifications. With this extraordinary procedure, the United States in effect formally endorsed the Israeli position. Barak's unmodifiable proposal, which was never published, only reconstructed by participants after the event, was acceptable to the Palestinians in several crucial respects. These included permanent Israeli control of the Jordan River Valley and of Palestine's airspace, and therefore of access to the outside world, which meant the projected Palestinian state would not be truly sovereign. Israel's continued control over West Bank water resources, as well as its annexation of areas that would have divided the West Bank into several isolated blocks. Not surprisingly, the greatest gulf between the two sides was over the disposition of Jerusalem. Israel demanded exclusive sovereignty, including over the entire Haram al-Sharif and most of the rest of the Old City, which was a central element to the ultimate breakdown of the talks. There is extensive literature on the Camp David summit. Much of it is self-serving or meretricious, notably the work of one of its key architects, Dennis Ross, The Missing Piece, The Inside Story of the Fight for the Middle East Peace, New York, Farrar, Straus, and Giroux, 2004. The best account is by Clayton Swisher, The Truth About Camp David, The Untold Story About the Collapse of the Middle East Peace Process, New York, Nation Books, 2004. Clinton thereafter proceeded to blame Arafat for the summit's failure, although he had earlier pledged not to do so. Even before the talks ended, Barak began briefing journalists on Arafat's obstructionism and was soon proclaiming that the Palestinians did not desire peace. This strategy was ultimately self-defeating. Barak looked foolish for having attended a summit that was bound to fail. If his assessment of Arafat and the PLO was correct, it also cast into question the entire approach of Rabin, Perez, Barak, and Israel's Labor Party. The immediate beneficiary of Barak's tactical missteps was Ariel Sharon, who now led the Likud and had the merit of consistency. He had always said no agreement was possible with the Palestinians and had ferociously opposed the Oslo Accords. On the Palestinian side, the recriminations flew after the last-ditch salvage effort confirmed that Israel was unwilling to accept anything resembling full Palestinian sovereignty, that the Oslo process would therefore not produce a resolution that met minimal Palestinian demands, and that the miserable status quo would continue. All of this strengthened Hamas and led to the unprecedented polarization in the Palestinian polity, creating a gulf within the population. At this point, Hamas constituted the most serious threat since the mid-1960s of the hegemony of Fatah within the PLO and the monopoly of the PLO over Palestinian politics. The worsening situation for Palestinians after Oslo, the fading prospect of statehood, and the intense rivalry between the PLO and Hamas combined to produce the flammable material that erupted into the Second Intifada in September 2000. It required only a match to set it off. A provocative visit by Ariel Sharon to the Haram al-Sharif, surrounded by hundreds of security personnel, provided that match. The Haram, known to Jews as the Temple Mount, had been a focus of nationalist and religious passions for both sides, at least since the bloody events of 1929, when a flag-waving demonstration by rowdy Zionist revisionists, extremists, at the adjacent Western Wall set off days of violence all over the country, with hundreds of casualties on each side. For details, see Rana Barakat, The Jerusalem Fella, Popular Politics in Mandate-Era Palestine, Journal of Palestine Studies 46, number 1, autumn 2016, 7 through 19, and Criminals or Martyrs, British Colonial Legacy in Palestine and the Criminalization of Resistance, Omran 6, November 2013. See also Hillel Cohen, 1929, Year Zero of the Arab-Israeli Conflict, Boston, Brandeis University Press, 2015. Palestinian concerns were heightened immediately after the 1967 conquest of the eastern part of the city, when the occupation authorities destroyed an entire neighborhood adjoining the Haram, Harat al-Maghriba, the Maghribi quarter, together with its mosques, shrines, homes, and shops, in order to create a vast esplanade adjoining the western wall. Many of the sites destroyed during the night of June 10th through 11th by Israeli bulldozers were waqfs. Like the Madrasa al-Afdaliyah, established in 1190 by the Ayyubid ruler al-Malik al-Afdal, son of Saladin. For a list of the Muslim religious shrines and mosques destroyed as part of the creation of the Western Wall Plaza, see R. Khalidi, The Future of Arab Jerusalem, British Journal of Middle East Studies, 19, number 2, fall 1993, pages 139 through 40. The most detailed analysis of the establishment, history, and destruction of the Harat al-Maghriba is Vincent Lemire, O. P. Dumur, Histoire du Quartier Maghrébin de Jerusalem, 1187 to 1967. Forthcoming. Architectural and archaeological information, as well as illustrations of many of these destroyed sites, can be found in Michael Hamilton Burgoyne, Mamluk, Jerusalem, an architectural study, London, World of Islam Festival Trust, 1987. Another destroyed 2 years later was the ancient Zawiya al-Fakhira. The Zawiya, a former Sufi lodge adjacent to the Haram, had become the residence of the Abu al-Saud family, who were traditionally its administrators. Yitzhak Reader, Islamic Endowments in Jerusalem under British Mandate, London, Cass, 1996, pages 136. This is where Yasser Arafat, whose mother was an Abu Saud, was born in 1929. According to my cousin, Rakia Khalidi, Kamil, who reported visiting her neighbors, the Abu Saud family, together with her mother to congratulate them on the birth of their newborn boy, Interview Jerusalem, July 26, 1993. A Sufi lodge immediately adjacent to the Haram. With the city now closed to West Bank and Gaza, Palestinians, and Israeli settlers' ongoing expansion into East Jerusalem, residents feared that they were about to be supplanted. In 1999, 1 year earlier, Israel had opened a tunnel running beneath much of the Old City and adjoining the Haram, causing damage to properties above in the Muslim quarter, and sparked widespread demonstrations. Sharon's visit coming soon after the failed Camp David summit, could not have happened at a worse moment. Sharon, who was campaigning to follow Barak as prime minister, heaped fuel on the flames, declaring, quote, "The Temple Mount is in our hands and will remain in our hands," unquote. Suzanne Goldberg, rioting as Sharon visits Islam holy site. Guardian, September 29, 2000. Given Sharon's reckless and opportunistic record, it seems clear that he intended to exploit the volatile context to better position himself to win the upcoming elections, which he succeeded in doing a few months later. The result of his provocation was the worst upsurge of violence in the occupied territories since 1967. Violence which thereafter spread inside Israel via a wave of deadly suicide bombings. The increase in the level of bloodshed was striking. During the 8 years of the first Intifada, some 1,600 people were killed, an average of 177 per year, 12% of them Israelis. In the calmer 4 years that followed, 90 people died, or about 20 per year, 22% of them Israelis. By contrast, the 8 years of the second Intifada left 6,600 dead, an average of 825 per year, about 1,100 Israelis, just under 17%, and 4,916 Palestinians who were killed by Israeli security forces and settlers. Over 600 Palestinians were also killed by other Palestinians. Most of the Israelis who died in the latter period were civilians killed by Palestinian suicide bombers inside Israel, while 332, just under a third of the total, were members of the security forces. The striking increase in number of those killed during the Second Intifada gives a sense of the sharp escalation of violence. All figures are from tables published by the indispensable B'Tselem, the Israeli Information Center for Human Rights in the Occupied Territories. While the rivalry between Hamas and the PLO played a role in this escalation, the Israeli forces' massive use of live ammunition against unarmed demonstrators from the outset. They fired 1.3 million bullets in the first few days of the uprising. Revon Petitzer, 1 million bullets. Haaretz, June 29, 2004. Was a crucial factor causing a shocking number of casualties. This mayhem eventually provoked some Palestinians, many of them from the PA security forces, to take up arms and explosives. It seemed to perceptive observers that the Israeli military was well prepared to escalate and may have intended to trigger such a development. Ibid. According to Petitzer's analysis, the Israeli High Command had decided beforehand on the crushing use of force in order that the Palestinians' ultimate defeat be, quote, burned into their consciousness, unquote. Predictably, Israel turned to heavy weapons, including helicopters, tanks, and artillery, producing even higher Palestinian casualties. Hamas and its junior partners in Islamic Jihad thereupon responded by mounting extensive assaults with suicide bombers who mainly attacked vulnerable civilian targets, buses, cafes, and shopping centers inside Israel. This tactic involved taking the violence, which had thus far been largely concentrated inside the occupied territories, to the enemy's home territory, and it was one against which Israel initially had no defense. Starting at the end of 2001, and with increasing frequency, Fatah joined in, producing a deadly competition. A murderous acceleration of suicide bombings followed, sparked in part by the rivalry between the two factions. According to one study of the first 5 years of the Second Intifada, almost 40% of the suicide bombings were carried out by Hamas. They were 26% by its ally Islamic Jihad, over 26% by Fatah, and the rest by the latter's partners in the PLO. Ephraim Ben-Lamech and Claude Beribi, Human Capital and the Productivity of Suicide Bombers, Journal of Economic Perspectives, 21, number 3, summer 2007, pages 223 through 38. The PLO had renounced violence in 1988, but as large numbers of demonstrators were shot by Israeli troops and as Hamas responded with suicide attacks, the pressure on Fatah to act grew, and escalation became inevitable. Triggered by the 1994 massacre inside the Ibrahimi Mosque in Hebron of 29 Palestinians by an armed settler between 1994 and 2000, Hamas and Islamic Jihad had pioneered the use of suicide bombers inside Israel as part of their campaign against the Oslo Accords, killing 171 Israelis in 27 bombings. By the end of that period, however, these attacks had largely contained by the ferocious repression exercised by the PA security services. The PLO leadership pushed to stop these attacks at all costs to keep the limping Oslo process going. To that end, the PA security apparatus, largely made up of Fatah militants who had served time in Israeli jails, used torture on Hamas suspects just as freely as Israeli interrogators had used it on them. Such experiences engendered deep fratricidal hatred on both sides, which was to erupt in the open PLO-Hamas split starting in the mid-2000s. In stark contrast to the first and second In stark contrast to the first, the Second Intifada constituted a major setback for the Palestinian national movement. Its consequences for the occupied territories were severe and damaging. In 2002, with its heavy weapons causing widespread destruction, the Israeli army reoccupied the limited areas, mainly cities and towns, that had been evacuated as part of the Oslo Accords. That same year, Israeli troops imposed their siege of Yasser Arafat's Ramallah headquarters, where he fell mortally ill. Having avoided meeting with him after my disappointing encounter in Gaza in 1994, I was encouraged to see the ailing old man by my friend Sari Nuzabeh and visited him twice during the siege, finding him much diminished physically and mentally. It was my impression that his mental decline began earlier and may have dated back to the 1992 crash landing of a plane carrying him in the Libyan desert that killed several of those aboard and left him injured. Yusuf Ibrahim. Arafat is found safe in Libyan desert after crash. New York Times, April 9, 1992. This harsh treatment of the Palestinian people's historic leader was demeaning, as Ariel Sharon intended it to be. It also confirmed the grave error the PLO had made in moving almost all of its leadership into the occupied territories, where they were vulnerable to such humiliations. Coming after the collapse of the Camp David summit, Israel's reoccupation of the cities and towns of the West Bank and Gaza Strip shattered any remaining pretense that the Palestinians had or would acquire something approaching sovereignty or real authority over any part of their land. It exacerbated the political differences among Palestinians and underlined the absence of a viable alternative strategy, revealing the failure of both the PLO's diplomatic course and the armed violence of Hamas and others. These events showed that Oslo had failed, that the use of guns and suicide bombings had failed, and that for all the casualties inflicted on Israeli civilians, the biggest losers in every way were the Palestinians. Another consequence was that the terrible violence of the Second Intifada erased the positive image of Palestinians that had evolved since 1982 and through the First Intifada and the peace negotiations. With horrifying scenes of recurrent suicide bombings transmitting globally, and with this coverage eclipsing that of much greater violence perpetrated against the Palestinians, Israelis ceased to be seen as oppressors, reverting to the more familiar role of victims or of irrational, fanatic tormentors. The potent negative impact of the Second Intifada for the Palestinians and the effect of suicide bombings on Israeli opinion and politics certainly bear out the trenchant critique of the Palestinians' employment of violence expressed by the Iqbal Ahmed back in the 1980s. Such considerations were undoubtedly far from the minds of the men and a few women who planned and carried out these suicide bombings. It is possible to speculate on what they sought to achieve, even while showing how flawed their aims were. Even if one accepts their own narrative, which sees suicide bombings as retaliation for Israelis' indiscriminate use of live ammunition against unarmed demonstrators for the first several weeks of the Second Intifada, and its attacks on Palestinian civilians and assassinations in Gaza, that begs the question of whether these bombings were meant to achieve anything more than blind revenge. It also leads the fact that Hamas and Islamic Jihad, which launched 2/3 of the suicide bombings during the Intifada, had carried out over 20 such attacks in the 1990s before Sharon's visit to the Haram. It may be argued that these attacks were meant to deter Israel. This is risible given the long-established doctrine of the Israeli military that irrespective of the cost, it must gain the upper hand in any confrontation and establish its unchallenged capacity not only to deter its enemies, but to crush them. This doctrine is powerfully analyzed by Petitzer, 1 million bullets. Sharon did just that during the Second Intifada, faithfully implementing this doctrine, as had Rabin before him during the First Intifada, although in the previous case at great political cost, as Rabin himself recognized. Equally risible is the idea that such attacks on civilians were hammer blows that might lead to a dissolution of Israeli society. This theory is based on a widespread but fatally flawed analysis of Israel as a deeply divided and artificial polity, which ignores the manifestly successful nation-building efforts of Zionism over more than a century, as well as the cohesiveness of Israeli society in spite of its many internal divisions. But the most important factor missing in whatever calculations were being made by those who planned the bombings was the fact that the longer the attacks continued, the more unified the Israeli public became behind Sharon's hardline posture. In effect, suicide bombings served to unite and strengthen the adversary, while weakening and dividing the Palestinian side. By the end of the Second Intifada, according to the reliable polls, most Palestinians opposed the tactic. The most reliable and consistent polling over the past few decades has been done by the Jerusalem Media Communications Center. According to their poll, number 52, issued in December 2004, a majority of Palestinians opposes military operations against Israeli targets as a suitable response under the current political conditions. Thus, besides raising grave legal and moral issues and depriving the Palestinians of a positive media image, on a strategic level, these attacks were massively counterproductive. Whatever blame attaches to Hamas and Islamic Jihad for the suicide bombings that produced this fiasco, the PLO leadership that eventually followed suit must also share it. I think I'm going to stop there. Definitely we'll finish this the next time around. I do not think I'm going to be able to finish this today, so might as well just split it up. Yeah. Thank you guys for being here. We are on page 216, and we will be done with this book next time around. Have a great one.